During the final days of the Clone Wars, the most powerful Jedi Master alive traveled alone to the ancient home world of the Dark Lords, and the planet subjected him to trials so intense they nearly broke him. It is not simply a graveyard, it is something far more deliberate, a world that stored dark-side power, manufactured authority from centuries of ritual and ruin, and consumed nearly every soul that walked its surface. What Yoda walked into had been building for longer than most people expect. Not hundreds of years, not thousands, tens of thousands. The planet goes by two names, Moraband in the shows, and Korriban in the older stories, and this video uses both. What matters is what the world did to everyone who set foot on it, and why no one in the galaxy ever managed to stop it. Drawing from both canon and legend sources, with legends carrying most of the weight, this is the full history of a world that shaped the galaxy more than most civilizations did. Chapter 1. Before the Sith. The red dust of Korriban has been settling over the bones of the fallen for longer than most civilizations have existed. Before anyone built the first tomb, before anyone carved the first name into stone, this planet was already wrong. Barren canyon walls stripped of nearly all life, a sky the light never quite breaks through, and silence where there should be wind. The landscape does not just look empty, it looks used. To understand why Yoda's visit nearly broke him, you have to understand what was already in the ground when he landed. The Force clings to places where suffering and ritual have built up over long stretches of time. The cave on Dagobah, where Luke Skywalker confronted his own doubts, is one small example. A place where dark-side energy concentrated to an unusual degree. Most places like that are contained to a single cave or chamber. Korriban is not a single dark spot, it is the whole planet. Even the earliest legend sources, which carry most of this history, only scratch the surface of what was building here. Much of the planet's earliest history comes from those legends' accounts. Long before any civilization claimed this world, Korriban was already radiating dark-side energy strong enough to register from the far side of the galaxy. Ancient empires that existed long before the Sith recognized that power and marked the planet as significant. Those empires eventually collapsed. Korriban kept pulling, and yet, the Dark Lords did not create the corruption rooted in this world. They inherited it. The species that evolved here, a red-skinned people known simply as the Sith, were Force-sensitive from the beginning, and their culture, shaped by centuries of isolation on a world already leaning toward the shadow of the Force, was built around dark-side traditions from the start. They practiced alchemy and blood sacrifice, and their burial sites were not cultural decoration, but structures built to serve a specific function. The tombs they carved were sealed chambers designed to store dark-side energy, trap the essence of the departed inside the walls, and channel the life force of sacrificed servants into the stone itself. Every tomb worked like a battery, a contained system that built up dark-side power and released it slowly into the surrounding landscape over centuries. The more powerful the individual laid to rest inside, the more concentrated the energy stored within the walls, and they never stopped building them. Unlike a scar left by a single battle, the weight pressing down on Korriban does not fade at any point in its recorded history. It compounds, growing heavier with every tomb added to the landscape. Each generation inherited a world more saturated than the one before, and left it heavier still. The planet cycled through periods of habitation and abandonment, but even when its surface lay empty for centuries, the tombs kept working. The energy stored in the walls did not need living caretakers. It sustained itself, drawing from the suffering sealed inside, and releasing it slowly into the surrounding ground. By the time outside forces arrived, the species had been layering this power into the rock for millennia. The world was loaded beyond anything they fully understood. Even then, the people who would push Korriban past the breaking point had already lost a war, and they were already looking for somewhere to land. Chapter 2. The Exiled Jedi. The struggle that produced the Sith tradition did not begin in Korriban. It began inside the Jedi Order. The Legends timeline carries the fullest account of what happened next. A faction of Jedi had turned toward the dark side, practicing forms of alchemy and force manipulation the Order had long forbidden. After a prolonged conflict later called the 100-Year Darkness, the Order defeated them. The question of what came next would define the galaxy for longer than anyone alive at the time could have imagined. The victors faced a choice that would echo through galactic history longer than almost any other single decision. They could carry out final judgment on the defeated Darksiders. They could imprison them with no end in sight, or they could exile them, sending them beyond Republic space and letting distance do what Force of Arms had not finished. The Jedi chose exile. Their philosophy demanded compassion, and a mass execution was incompatible with what the Order believed itself to stand for. The defeated faction, led by a man named Ajunta Pall, was stripped of weapons and cast into uncharted space, and what they found would reshape the galaxy for 25,000 years. They found Korriban, and what followed was not simply a conquest, but a fusion, and the thing it produced was more formidable than either side could have created alone. The Sith tradition was born from that exchange. Ajunta Pall and his followers arrived on a world inhabited by Force-sensitive people who had been practicing dark-side traditions longer than the Jedi Order had existed. The exiles conquered them by force, but the deeper exchange ran in both directions. The exiles brought advanced knowledge of the Force, techniques, and depth of understanding the native species had never developed. In return, the original inhabitants offered centuries of refined burial craft, deep ritual knowledge rooted in their specific environment, and a working relationship with a planet that was itself a reservoir of dark-side power. Together, on a world already saturated with that energy, they built something the galaxy had never seen before, a civilization where the Force itself was engineered into the landscape. The consequences would outlast every person involved by millennia. The Jedi Order that made exile possible would spend the rest of its existence dealing with what that mercy produced. The Valley of the Dark Lords began to take shape during this period, carved through the landscape as a deep corridor lined with tomb entrances and flanked by towering statues of the lords who rested inside. With every generation, the valley grew larger and heavier. Each new lord demanded a burial grander than the last, and the corridor stretched deeper into the canyon with every addition. What had started as a burial ground was becoming something else entirely, a seat of authority that outlasted every individual who contributed to it. Even so, the man who started it all could not escape what his creation became. Ajunta Pall, the first Dark Lord, was eventually entombed in the same stone that he had helped shape. The Legends novel Revan reveals that when visitors found his tomb millennia later, the presence waiting inside was not triumphant. It was full of regret, one of the only Dark Lords in the entire historical record to express anything resembling remorse from beyond the grave. The man who had started everything wished he could take it back. The valley did not care. It fed on the regret the same way it fed on any other suffering sealed into its walls. The tradition Pall founded would outlast him by millennia, and the valley it filled would grow into the most feared corridor in the galaxy, the same corridor Yoda would one day walk alone. Chapter 3: Valley of Lords. As the centuries passed, the Valley of the Dark Lords grew into something no other place in the galaxy could match. Red rock and sand stretched between the monuments, and the air itself felt heavier the deeper anyone walked. The valley worked like a resonance chamber, the same way a cathedral amplifies sound by shaping how waves interact in a shared space. Each burial strengthened the next, and the combined effect of dozens of tombs radiating at once produced a surrounding weight far more powerful than any single burial could generate on its own. With every new tomb added to the system, the chamber grew louder. The air itself carried the charge. The lords did not build their tombs as memorials. They built them as instruments. They filled burial chambers with weapons, encrypted knowledge, ritual constructs, and traps designed to kill. Through ceremonies refined over generations, they sealed their essences into the tomb walls, preserving their awareness long after death. The more lethal a tomb, the more famous its occupant became. The more famous the occupant, the more ambitious seekers came to attempt the challenges within. Anyone who entered the valley was tested. Anyone who tested was changed. No one walked through the valley the same person they were when they walked in. In death, the Lords of the Valley became a governing body of the departed, still conducting examinations and still passing judgments centuries after their time had ended. Among the most discussed was Tulak Horde, whose combined mastery of lightsaber combat and raw force power made his reputation one of the most enduring in the history of the Ancient Order. Accounts describing ending duels before they truly began, moving with a speed and precision that left opponents certain the outcome was already decided. His command of the Force was no less direct, draining the will from entire groups before a blade was ever drawn. He sealed the essence of his own servant inside his tomb, so the man's torment would continue as a permanent offering long after both of them were gone. Nagasato's ambitions reached far enough to spark a full-scale offensive against the Republic, and his burial chamber contained objects so volatile that trained practitioners did not enter it casually even centuries later. Still, no figure showed how the valley truly worked more clearly than Mark Aragnos. He ruled for a century, and when he fell, his presence appeared at the entrance to his tomb to judge which of his rivals deserved to succeed him. Even in death, Ragnos was still setting the terms. Two lords, Nagasato and Ludo Kresh, stood before that apparition and competed for the title. The contest was not resolved cleanly. Their rivalry tore the Empire apart and drove Sato to launch a campaign against the Republic, believing that conquest would settle the question of power Ragnos had left open. The Republic crushed that offensive and then struck back with a retaliation campaign that hit the ancient worlds from orbit, scattered populations, and targeted the temples the Order had built over generations. One fallen lord had judged two living ones. Two living ones had torn an empire apart. Apparitions rising from burial chambers to confront the living, visions designed to test and manipulate, all of it still running when Yoda walked into the valley millennia later. The dead were still setting the galaxy on fire from inside their tombs. Other dark side worlds exist, but none of them work the way Korriban does. As shown in Rebels, Malachor is a shattered world, its surface littered with the remains of warriors frozen in the moment of their final stand. The power there is real and intense, but it has a fixed character sealed in place by a single devastating event. Malachor stopped developing the instant that event ended. Every other dark side world in the galaxy shares some version of the same limitation, power that is either frozen in place, tied to a single culture, or dependent on infrastructure that someone could locate and dismantle. Korriban does not stay in one place. It reaches out, draws force-sensitive people from vast distances, and either breaks them or sends them back into the galaxy carrying its influence. It does not wait for visitors, it calls to them, and the system that built this engine had been refining itself for longer than most galactic governments had existed. Chapter 4: The Sith Machine. A young man arrived in Korriban with nothing but ability and anger. No title, no lineage, no recognized claim to anything. By the time he left, he had become the single most important figure in the history of the Ancient Order, the architect of a 1,000-year plan that ended with the fall of the Jedi Order and the rise of the Galactic Empire. The Legends novel Path of Destruction tells his story. His name was Bane, and what happened to him is the clearest record of what Korriban's system actually does to the people who walk into it. The first layer of that process is the planet functioning as political ground. Every major dark-side regime in galactic history returned to Korriban, not out of tradition for its own sake, but because controlling the planet sent a signal with real consequences in a galaxy where the Force is physically felt. A lord who held Korriban gained direct access to a planetary well of dark-side energy that rivals could sense from an entire region away. Empires that control this world projected an authority that any regime based elsewhere simply could not match, because the authority was not symbolic alone, it was something people could feel. The second layer is the Academy, and this is where Bane's story cuts deepest. Academies operated on Korriban across multiple distinct eras, and each reflected the civilization that built it. During the Brotherhood of Darkness, the era Bane lived through and then dismantled, the Academy ran under a philosophy Bane came to regard as deeply flawed, one that rewarded cooperation and collective strength rather than individual power. What united every version of the Academy in every era was its core function. It was a filter. Path of Destruction shows students competing against each other in direct combat and being sent into ancient tombs on assignments expected to kill a significant number of them. The planet's constant dark side pressure bore down on students without relief and without protection. Instructors did not shield them. They evaluated them. The Fallen were not a failure of the design. They were proof it was working. Bane survived, but the planet did far more than test him. His direct encounters with the tombs reshaped him from the ground up. He discovered a holocron that challenged his entire understanding of how the dark side should be practiced, and through it came to see the Brotherhood not as a legitimate order, but as a corruption of everything the ancient lords had built. Path of Destruction shows his time on Korriban not as training but as excavation, the planet stripping away everything in him that was not essential until what remained was harder and sharper than anything that had walked in. By the time he left, Bane was no longer just a formidable man. He carried the authority to dismantle the existing order and replace it with the rule of two. That structure would outlast him by 1,000 years and end with the fall of the Jedi themselves. But none of these parts would matter on their own, and Bane was not the exception. He was proof that the system worked. Together, they create a feedback loop that makes everything else permanent. Force-sensitive people are drawn to the planet from vast distances, some pulled by instinct, others seeking it deliberately. Once on the surface, the effects build. Creeping unease sharpens into dread. Unwanted thoughts arrive that feel less like imagination and more like memory. Visions pull from the specific fears of whoever's standing in the canyon. Those who fall on the planet add more suffering and power to the ground beneath them. Those who survive leave more deeply immersed in the dark side and carry the planet's influence back into the wider galaxy, becoming, knowingly or not, its next recruiters. The cycle has no natural endpoint. It is self-sustaining. By the time Yoda set foot on the surface, this loop had been running uninterrupted for longer than the Republic had existed. The reach of the system extended far beyond the valley itself, and the proof stretches back long before Bane's time. Frieda Nad sought out the tombs of Korriban, and as told in the Tales of the Jedi comics, found the spirit of the ancient Lord Nagasato waiting inside. He absorbed the teachings of the dark side at their source, and then carried that influence to the distant world of Onderon, where he established his own dark side legacy that persisted for centuries. Korriban did not just hold its power, it exported it. Bane walked into this engine as raw material. He walked out as the most formidable practitioner alive. And when the planet needed to make its most powerful argument against Yoda, the last Jedi who would ever enter the valley, it was Bane's image it chose to send. Korriban had been forging people like Bane for longer than recorded history could fully account for. And for all that time, the galaxy had the power to stop it. Chapter 5. Why it survived. The reason Korriban survived is more unsettling than anything sealed inside its tombs. The galaxy had the power to act. It had the knowledge. It had the motivation, and at several points in history, it tried. And yet, the system kept running. Not because the Dark Lords were unbeatable, but because every institution that tried to stop it made choices that felt reasonable in the moment, and together guaranteed nothing would ever be finished. Much of the history in this chapter comes from legend sources, where the Republic's repeated failures to deal with Korriban are most fully recorded. The earliest mistake began before Korriban even became a Sith world. The Jedi Order's decision to exile the defeated Darksiders after the 100-Year Darkness was made in genuine good faith. Exile was the compassionate middle ground between execution and indefinite imprisonment. The exiles found Korriban, they founded the Sith tradition. 25,000 years of recurring conflict trace a direct line back to that single decision. More critically, the choice set an example the galaxy would repeat after every major defeat that followed. Survivors were allowed to scatter, rather than being tracked to the end. The most devastating example of what happens when survivors are allowed to scatter is the figure known in legends as Vitiate. After the Republic crushed the Sith Empire in the Great Hyperspace War, Vitiate gathered the remaining lords on a world called Nathema. He drew life force from every one of them and from every other living thing on the planet through a ritual so complete it stripped Nathema of the Force entirely. What had been a living world became a silent, empty shell, a planet with no Force presence at all. As if the energy itself had been ripped out of the ground, Vitiate walked away effectively immortal, disappeared into the unknown regions, and spent over 1,000 years rebuilding in secret before emerging with a fully restored empire. He had trained in Korriban, he had walked the valley and stood in the tombs of the ancient lords. The conviction that power justified everything, that the end of life was a problem to be solved rather than accepted, those were the lessons the planet had been teaching since before he was born. Korriban did not simply shape him, it made him possible. When the Republic tried force instead of patience, the result was no better. The retaliation campaign after that same war was the most aggressive attempt any government ever made to end the threat for good. Sith worlds were struck from orbit, populations were scattered, and temples were deliberately targeted in what was meant as the complete destruction of an entire civilization. And yet, it failed in the one place that actually mattered. Surface structures could be destroyed, physical monuments could be shattered, but the dark side energy stored inside the tombs, the sealed essences, the weapons, the power woven into the rock over millennia, all of it survived the assault untouched. The Republic had leveled every visible sign of a threat while leaving the actual source intact. And now, no one was watching it. The campaign did not destroy the threat, it pushed it deeper underground, leaving it to grow quietly for the next civilization ambitious enough to return. Centuries after the bombardment, a small expedition returned to the Valley of the Dark Lords. They expected ruins. What they found were tombs still active, defenses untouched, the dark side still radiating from the canyon walls as if the war had never happened. The dark side energy stored in the burial chambers had not needed the surface structures to survive. It had been woven into the rock itself, and it was still building. The Republic had declared victory over a world that had not even noticed the attack. Quietly, the most damaging response of all had already been underway for centuries. The Jedi Order did not try to destroy Korriban or reclaim it. They avoided it. Rather than treating the planet as a threat requiring ongoing attention, the Order treated it as something spiritually contaminating, a place where serious study felt forbidden. The Clone Wars shows that when Yoda announced his intention to travel to Moraband, the Council's reaction was not a strategic concern. It was an alarm rooted in legend and institutional reluctance. Every time a Jedi Master warned an apprentice about the dangers of the ancient homeworld, anyone already drawn towards the dark side heard confirmation that the power was real. The Order's avoidance became a standing invitation, broadcast to everyone the shadow had already reached. And it meant that when Yoda finally decided to go, he went without any institutional knowledge of what he was actually walking into. No Jedi had studied the planet in generations. No protocols existed. He was walking in blind, armed with nothing except the Force and 800 years of training. Compassion that created the enemy. Force that missed the target. Avoidance that advertised the threat. 3 responses across thousands of years, and each decision made sense on its own terms. Together, they guaranteed the system would never stop. At the very end, when the Jedi Order was already in its final years without knowing it, one Jedi finally went to see for himself. Chapter 6: Yoda's Trial. Of all the beings who ever set foot on that world, only one went there not to gain power, but to prove he could survive without wanting it. In the final season of the Clone Wars, Yoda began hearing the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn, the Jedi Master who had fallen on Naboo more than a decade earlier. Qui-Gon had achieved something the Jedi Order had believed lost for centuries, a form of awareness preserved after death, a continuing connection to the living Force. The voice guided Yoda to the priestesses, mysterious beings who existed at a boundary between the living world and what lay beyond it, and who held a secret to life after death. They set Yoda on a series of trials, each one testing a different dimension of what he was and what he carried. One trial forced him to face a shadow inside himself, the parts of his own nature he had spent centuries keeping in check. His purpose through all of it was to preserve the Jedi through whatever lay ahead. The last and deepest trial required him to travel to the one place the Jedi Council had spent generations refusing to go, Moraband. He went knowing exactly what it was. From the moment he entered the atmosphere, the dark side was already pressing against him. It did not wait for him to approach the tombs or descend into the valley. On the surface, the wait was immediate. The canyon walls of the valley rose around him, lined with the same tombs that had been collecting power since before the Republic existed. Every burial chamber he passed still held the sealed essence of the Lord within, and every one of them registered his presence. The Force pressing on him, shown across that final Clone Wars arc, was not passive but directed, searching for entry points, finding the places where even the most disciplined mind carries something unresolved, and leaning on them. The planet showed him a vision of the Clone Wars resolved in a single moment, a false reality where the conflict ended. The Jedi survived, and everything he had been carrying simply stopped hurting. The temple on Coruscant was intact. The younglings were safe. The war had never reached the places it should not have been allowed to reach. It offered him the thing any exhausted leader would want the most, the lie that the struggle was already over. After 800 years of service and 3 years of watching the Order bleed out across a conflict he could not win, that vision was designed to find exactly where Yoda was most tired. He saw through it. Then the planet sent something older against him. Among the things that confronted Yoda was an apparition of Bane, the Lord whose time on Korriban had given him the authority to reshape the entire Order and establish the rule of two. Korriban selected the most potent symbol it had ever produced. Bane was the end product of everything this world had ever made. The man it had shaped and released into the galaxy to change it forever. His image was the planet's most powerful argument, a demonstration that its methods worked. Yoda recognized it for what it was and held his ground. What followed carried more weight than anything that came before it. In the final episode of that arc, Sidious himself reached through the Force to confront Yoda directly. The Dark Lord, who had spent decades orchestrating the fall of the Republic from within, now turned his full attention to the one Jedi who would come closest to sensing his presence. Working through deception and temptation, he forced a choice where every option led to the betrayal of something Yoda held sacred: save one life and condemn another. Act and cause harm, or refuse to act and allow it. And he did not come alone. Every tomb in the valley discharged at once against Yoda. The interconnected burial chambers, the sealed remnants, the dark side energy built into rock over generations of ritual and sacrifice, all of it focused on a single point. In that moment, the full weight of 25,000 years of accumulated power pressed against 800 years of conviction, and Sidious was betting it would be enough. Yoda survived by refusing the terms entirely. He did not choose between the options. He rejected the premise that those were the only choices available. In doing so, he proved the one thing Korriban had never been able to account for in its entire history: someone who could stand inside the full weight of its shadow and simply choose not to be moved by it. The planet had broken students, consumed lords, and buried civilizations. It could not break him. Not because he was stronger, but because he wanted nothing from it. And then, he left. He carried what he had learned and told no one. He proposed no follow-up action. He convened no strategic review. Whatever understanding he took from Moraband stayed inside him and went no further into the institution he led. When he returned, the Jedi Order's relationship with the planet was exactly what it had been before he arrived. There was no way to turn one person's understanding into a shared response, and the Order had spent too long not building that kind of process. No one else would learn what he had learned. Within months, the Order would fall. The Clone Wars would end not with the victory Yoda had spent 3 years trying to secure, but with the destruction of almost everything the Jedi had built across generations. The journey that had taken Yoda through the priestesses and through Moraband, the understanding of how to preserve consciousness beyond death, would prove to be among the last things of real value the Old Order produced. Moraband had been the final proving ground, and Yoda had walked out carrying a knowledge that the coming destruction could not erase. Yoda's journey to Moraband was not a turning point, it was a farewell. The deepest terror of Korriban is not the power stored in its tombs, or the remnants that still inhabit them. It is the fact that the planet survived, not because of some unstoppable force, but because of ordinary choices made by well-meaning people operating under understandable limits. The Republic commanders who declared victory and went home were not fools. The Jedi who looked away were not cowards. No single person failed. The response failed, and it kept failing so quietly that no one noticed it had become permanent. Just another part of how the galaxy worked. That is the story Korriban tells about the galaxy that created it. Not a story about the power of the dark side, but a story about the cost of choosing comfort over completion, generation after generation, until no single generation could undo what all the ones before it had allowed. The shadow over Korriban did not disappear when Yoda left. What Yoda carried away from Moraband stayed with him through the fall of the Jedi Order, through exile, through decades of silence, and when he finally chose a place to disappear, he did not pick somewhere clean. He picked another world where the dark side had already settled into the ground, and his reasons for choosing it say as much about him as anything he ever did on a battlefield. But Moraband was only one chapter in a life that stretched across 900 years of galactic history. The full story of what shaped him, what he built, what he lost, and what he carried to the very end is something that deserves to be told from the beginning.